Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Hi. Thanks for coming out. You're a very handsome crowd. My name is Leela Durkach. I'm one of the co-owners of Chopin Theater. I'd like to welcome you today and introduce Lisa Wagner, Executive Director of the Guild Complex. We'll get the event started, but just a little history on why we're doing this. We opened the theater in 1990, 27 years ago. And back then, it was a very different neighborhood, very vibrant. And over time, that has changed. And we wanted to do this event to talk about how the existence of art can impact quality of life. This is the 2017 is the year of public art in the city of Chicago. So that is another reason for doing the event today, to take a look at how public art can improve your quality of life, bring communities together. And we'd like to start with this poem by Gwendolyn Brooks in 1967, when the first piece of public art was unveiled in downtown Chicago. She was commissioned to do a poem. Some perspective on that first piece of art, it was the Chicago Picasso. Many of you probably know about it. It was commissioned by the first Mayor Daley, lots of outside funding. Pablo Picasso was commissioned to do it. He never set foot in the city. He did everything from afar. It was built in Gary, Indiana. It was plopped down in the center of the city. And when it was unveiled, people didn't know what it was. There was lots of debate about what is this thing and why is it here, and it doesn't speak to the people of Chicago. And so from that very top-down effort, Gwendolyn Brooks wrote this poem from the everyman's effort. And I'd just like to read it for you a little bit. Does man love art? Man visits art, but squirms. Art hurts. Art urges voyages, and it is easier to stay at home. The nice beer ready. In common rooms, we belch or sniff or scratch. Are raw, but we must cook ourselves and style ourselves for art. Who is a requiring courtesan? We squirm. We do not hug the Mona Lisa. We may touch or tolerate an astounding fountain or a horse and rider, at most another lion. Observe the tall cold of a flower, which is as innocent and as guilty, as meaningful and as meaningless as any other flower in the Western field. So with that, Lisa and I would just like to talk a little bit about public art and how it gets generated. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi. Good morning. Welcome. So Leah and I started talking about public art. So my background's in nonprofit administration, but also as a writer. And the Guild Complex was in this neighborhood for quite a while, and the neighborhood has changed dramatically, and so too has our mission in terms of how we execute that, because we've had to go citywide instead of more locationally specific. And part of that is to speak to this very question of public art. Public art has many applications, and what we're talking about today is this top-down or bottom-up expression of that thing. And it's big money. I was just saying to Leela this morning that New York City spent $17.2 billion on art projects in the last 2 years ago. And only about 8 billion of that went to artists, which is, seems substantial. But when we think about that gap, it's big business. They say the tourist industry that people tack on about a day and a half to go see public institutions of art, so museums and all these sorts of things. In Chicago, of course, the Art Institute was just voted the #1 museum in the world to come see. So that's huge business. And when we think about this poem, Gwendolyn Brooks, the first Black Pulitzer Prize winner, but also Poet Laureate of Illinois, right when this poem was written, was commissioned to write something that she'd never seen. She had only seen a model of this thing. She saw it unveiled at the same time everybody else did.
Right.
So you're asking a person who's been outside of the narrative, who's suddenly become central to a narrative, talk about something that she's never seen that's supposed to now represent Chicago for big money and big politic. And I think it's an interesting way to begin the conversation about what is public art? What's the point of art in general? How does that lift us up? How does that elevate? How does that create expression across community? But when it's a top-down mechanism, with DCASE is looking at this 50 by 50, which they're celebrating arts organizations. They came to organizations this year and said, what are you doing? How are you going to celebrate? Those kinds of things. But in some ways, they also then co-opted those stories and made them their own again. For instance, tonight,
Yeah.
there's a parade, Arts in the Dark, that's being put on by Mark Kelly that came out of an initiative for Columbia College, and now that he's the commissioner for the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, he's sort of put out to the call to the art organizations that we need to participate in this to express how extraordinary the arts are in Chicago.
And
So,
50 by 50 is 50 years ago, the first piece of public art went in downtown Chicago, and there are 50 wards, so every ward is doing something top down to celebrate or commemorate public art. Yeah.
But so Leela and I we don't want to drag on here too long, but we've been talking a lot about Wicker Park. I live here. I used to party here in the 90s.
Y'all used to party here in the 90s. We were
I
really
know
old.
it well. And it's changing dramatically, and not necessarily how the community would have it changed.
Right.
And I think that was the impetus. And
That
we
is
can
the
talk more
impetus,
about that.
and we'll talk more about that later with some of our panelists. But you brought up a very interesting piece, because at the same time that this top-down initiative happened with the city through the first mayor, there was another initiative, very grassroots-oriented on the south side of Chicago, very organic, the Wall of Peace.
The Wall of Respect.
The Wall
yeah.
of Respect.
Which many of you probably have heard about. It's also celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. While it was torn down in 1971 because of a fire in the TV repair shop next door, which has been suspect across that community. It was at 43rd and Langley, if anyone knows the area, in Bronzeville. It was dedicated literally 2 weeks after this was dedicated, and Gwendolyn Brooks also wrote a poem for that. So it was you want me to talk more about it?
Yes,
So
please.
the Wall of Respect was a community-based organization. It was completely guerrilla art. Do you know Third World Press and Dr. Hakeem Matabuti? At the time, he was Don L. Lee. He was integral in getting that going. And actually, there's a documentary you can find online where Gwendolyn Brooks talks about having met him specifically. And as many of you may know, Gwendolyn Brooks was told her career would go on the rocks when she chose to publish with one of the first black publishers, because she had been picked up by these extraordinary people after Annie Allen was published and then became the awarded for the Pulitzer. So she did that as a political movement, and there's a quote in there from her where she basically says, can you imagine where my career would have gone if I hadn't met these young people who basically helped to radicalize her in a way? And the Wall of Respect, you can see this antithesis. I'll read the poem for you, but compared to this, where she's kind of talking about this top-down thing, where this thing is elusive and distant, she talks about community and how those arts movements happen. So this is coming out of that black arts movement on the South Side, completely guerrilla. And the quote is basically that they didn't think the person who owned the building would care all that much because they were absentee slumlords. So there was this empty wall. They decided they would make this thing there, and they represented black arts leaders from, well, there was actually a lot of debate whether Martin Luther King Jr. would go on the building because he wasn't radical enough for them. So Malcolm X was up there, famous musicians and other artists, Langston Hughes, et cetera, and also Gwendolyn Brooks. But what ended up happening with that is it became, for the gangs that were down there, this sort of neutral territory where the community came together and organized together to do this thing that represented them in a place that was their home, but in argument with the fact that they weren't being represented in the press. And this is 67, right? So this wall was dedicated August 29th in 67, where this was August 15th. So literally Gwendolyn Brooks writes this for the city, never having seen it. This thing dropped into the middle of downtown from a very powerful mayor that's all political, big money. I mean, it's still big money, right?
is
I mean,
big money,
we
yeah.
just, Nora just read her mom's poem for this 5550 celebration with Mark Kelly, and this huge to-do about it. That's big money. It was in every newspaper, blah, blah, blah. But August 29th came and went, and where was the news about the Wall of Respect? So some community leaders went down there. There was some hubbub down there. People went to the space. They celebrated the space. But citywide, there was a nod to it. So 50 by 50 is like, oh, yeah, Wall of Respect. That's important. But even 50 years later, this thing in the community that was fundamental to the Black arts movement as a space of clarity and personhood. What's this?
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, we're going. So I'll shut up. So anyway, but in terms of what's going on in this community and other public arts movements, it begs the question of here you have these two things in conversation.
Right.
Through the great poet, Gwendolyn Brooks, who we're also celebrating her centennial this year.
Right.
So it's 50 by 50 and a centennial and, right. It's also incidentally.
Very fortuitous time.
Right. And it's also incidentally Third World Press's 50th anniversary as well. So there's a number of things that are in conversation that aren't really being discussed, but Leela brought it up.
Yes, yes,
So-
we all brought it up. We're very interested in these things, being an independent theater ourselves. The whole idea that you can create change locally, just having government kind of get out of the way and let people be able to do things that they see fit and be really central and local in the community. We got the 5 minute sign, but do you want to maybe
Sure.
read a few passages from
Sure,
it?
sure. Okay, it's a short poem, not unlike this one. So this was dedicated, I said the 29th and the 27th, for Edgar Christmas. The side wall of a typical slum building on the corner of 43rd and Langley became a mural communicating Black dignity. That's out of Ebony. A drum, 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 humbly we come. South of Success and east of the gloss and glass are sandals, flower cloth, graves hoops of wood or gold pendant from black ears, reddish brown and ivory ears. Black boy men, black. Boy men on roofs, fist of black power, thou a little black stampede in African images of brass and flower swirl. Fists of black power, Titan's pretty eyes, leans back on mother country and is tracked, is treatise through her perfect and tight teeth. Women in wool hair chant their poetry. Phil Cochran gives his messages and music made of developed bone and polished and honed cult. It is the hour of tribe and of vibration, the day-long hour. It is the hour of ringing rouse, of ferment festival. On 43rd and Langley, black furnaces resent ancient legislatures of ploy and scruple and practiced gelatin. They keep the fever in, fondle the fever. All worship the wall. I monument the rattle wood. Walter says she is good, says she, our sister, is. In front of me, hundreds of faces, red, brown, black ivory, yield me hot trust, their yea and their announcement that they are ready to rile the high-flung ground. Behind me, paint. Heroes. No child has defied the heroes of this wall, this serious appointment, this still wing, this scald, this flute, this heavy light, this hinge. An emphasis is paroled. The old decapitations are revised, the dispositions bleakless, and we sing. No, it's not. It's very different,
Yeah,
right?
it's
So-
very. Hello, everyone. We're back inside. Hero will now talk a little bit about the process and some of his experience doing public art across 3 continents. So I will turn it over to Hero.
Okay. Hello again. So yeah, my name is Hiroyasu Tsuri. I'm originally from Japan, but I moved to Australia when I was 18, lived there for 10 years, met a beautiful wife, and we moved to Berlin 4 years ago. So I've been living in Berlin for the last 4 years, and yeah, I'm luckily a lot of offers coming from different places. In Chicago, I had the exhibition in the Vertical Gallery, and they connected me to Chopin Theatre. and there's a lot of forms of offer or like opportunity come to do public murals. That's how I have been painting a lot of places. But yeah, that's me. Yeah, I think we have other people talking together here. Okay, show the film. So I'm gonna show you quickly the process documentation my friend Naoto he made of this mural outside. So press play and can you kind of see? Yep. So I use a lot of different materials, and this time because Chicago has quite rough textured walls, so I use this water pump that it's normally used for gardening. I put some paint and water in, and that's how I sketched it up like that. When I was painting this, it looks like just making a mess. So a lot of people walk past, looked at me funnily, but this is a process I have to explain. You'll see something better. So, and then after that, I use poles and extension pole, which is easy to get everywhere, and also me being quite short, it's a good tool to reach high prices with this pole. And I have been practicing painting walls in a faster period, a short period of time. It's because when you paint in walls in a lot of different places, I find it's less hassle when you can actually paint fast, and also you can travel better that way. So yeah, is there any question regarding to the process?
What other massive outdoor, or what other outdoor murals did you do while you were here? Is this the only one you were able to do outdoor?
Outdoor mural, this is one of the biggest one I have done in Chicago, and I have done one rooftop piece on a friend's hotel. It's called the Publishing House near Morgan Station. So if you lie the Morgan Station to Ashley, is that the next station? Yeah, Ashland. Yeah. If you lie there, you can kind of see an old face up there. And yeah, I have been painting in a lot of different places. I think I have done some much bigger stuff also using similar technique.
Where are you and Kelly off to next? Are you going home to Australia or to Berlin? Or?
Yeah, to Berlin, but first things first, me and my father and Kelly, we're going to be driving down to Boston. So through Detroit, Buffalo, Albany, then New Bedford, and Boston. And Kelly's going to New York also.
To paint? Or just for travel?
Just for travel, yeah. I'll be paint, and after that, I'm actually going to Miami to paint some stuff also.
For Basel?
Not particularly. I'll be a bit early. I don't know. It's kind of a strange place when Basel's happening there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You paint smaller things before the
As like sketches or something. After school, yeah, I do paint a lot of smaller painting also. I do like working in a lot of different materials and different scales and different method and different concept. So I make smaller drawings, sculpture, video piece, some sound also, and yeah, a lot of different things. I like doing a lot of different things because I think each different things fit into a new idea to each different practices.
I like the coyote.
Thank you.
So please sit down so we can see you better.
Okay.
And we had some projection about your other work, but tell us about your experience on four continents.
Four continents.
In Asia, then Australia, then Europe, then here.
Okay. Where to start? I think first time I left Japan, it's because I just wanted to see different part of the world, and also originally I just went there for 10 months to study English, because in Japan education systems, I'm not really 100% sure education system here, but after high school, a lot of people go to university as an extension of it, and I didn't like the idea of just an extension to go to another study without knowing what you wanted to do. And I always liked the painting and making sculptures and making stuff, basically. So I wanted to see some creative field, but and I looked at a TAFE, do you call that? Sorry? No, it's like not the university, but the school for learning special skills, say, yeah, technical skills, yeah. So I looked at that option, but I just had too many things I wanted to do, so I just decided to go to Australia to study, and my parents are very supportive enough, so I got to go there. And when I get there, I just start meeting a lot of creative people through graffiti and skateboard culture. I think those culture doesn't need introduction, and they are quite inclusive as long as you have the same interest. That's already one common interest that you can become friends with anyone, even you can't speak much of a language. And I start getting to do a lot of murals and started getting invited to exhibitions and stuff. So I thought this is what I wanted to do. I just gonna stay here, in 10 months becoming 10 years. And I was doing pretty happily quite well in Australia, but coming from a small island, Japan, to Australia, which is a much bigger place, but it's also an island, very far from a lot of places. So me and Kelly decided, again, we wanted to see a different part of the world, and Berlin was a good place to based on to travel around. That's how I moved there.
But being Japanese, you have very strong identity. And then you move to Australia, which is another identity. And then you move to Europe, to Germany with their identity. Your reflection about those, or you are just the person through curiosity, you didn't have any adjustment.
I don't think I never, like, I don't know if anyone does, like, I don't know, maybe some people do, but I probably didn't actually think that's strongly, I'm Japanese, that's why I have to act the way I have to act. But at the same time, I probably did have some sort of, this one?
Any samples of your work?
What do you want to? Oh, okay. Just quickly do this. Sorry.
Records of your arrests and
So yeah, I never really thought my act is based on where I'm from, but I definitely got inspired and influenced by my surrounding. So I was talking to you, Zygmunt, before. Maybe I am not a stereotype character of a Japanese person. Maybe that's because I was living in Australia for 10 years, and especially because from when I was 18, I think my personality built it around a lot of different input. Is that what you? Yeah. Yeah.
So that very much biological selection of your subject. It's how that start? Is this part of Japan or part of Australia, or you just were born in?
I think.
Is there something from samurai here, or
No, this is. I use a lot of animal as a subject because animal seems to have some sort of meaning or the character attached to it, but it's depending on where you're from and what your background culture is. You have got kind of different stories and a meaning to those animals, and that's why I like using them. And I think especially when I do public murals, I think painting outside in that scale itself is already kind of a statement. And I think what I want to express there is joy and connection to the place. So it's not necessarily I'm bringing this subject from Japan or Australia. I actually normally search what's their native species there and trying to create sort of a connection to the place for me to paint something there. Yes? Okay. Yes? Yep.
There's some questions about like graffiti art versus kind of the sanctioned mural art. Can you speak a little bit to that? Like, is there a politic around the graffiti artists versus something that's more sanctioned, like you have a wall, it's legal for you to be there, and what that means for the community, if anything?
That's quite a difficult one for me to talk to for everyone. But my knowledge is, or my understanding and from my experience, it's depending on the city. There's some city has got a lot of graffiti, which I have to say I like it. And I understand this is not for everyone. And I think the idea of graffiti is you do it because you just want to do it. There's not much other reason to it. Versus mural, especially when it's commissioned by someone, you do have permission to be there, you do have a permission to paint there. But at the same time, I was talking to other people here today, when you do public murals, like this one actually got graffitied 1 week after, this one is in Miami. And I just built this understanding of this is how it is on the street. You can't really protect it. So I just accept it. But some people does get offended and get sad about it, which is kind of interesting.
Actually, you started talking about just now. I was wondering if you could talk about like, how do you process the transience of doing a mural art? Like your work is exposed to weather and strangers and champagne bottles being thrown at them and things like that. Like, how does that enrich it for you, or is that something you just kind of compartmentalize away and just continue to make it and don't think about that?
I actually take it as a part of it. Like even if it's get graffitied or like sometimes some people actually without permission they just add something to it. And once I leave something to the street, I think I just leave they have got their own life and they have got their own destiny to it. So I just leave them to it. Is that answer what you asked?
That does, yeah. I was wondering,
Yeah.
do you also do work that's not mural art, stuff that's more, I guess, protected, I guess, something that would be put in a museum or put online that doesn't get augmented?
Yeah, I do create some painting for museum and galleries also. But I think, both of them has got a strengths and also interesting point for me. So I like doing both.
All right, everyone. Good morning again. And thank you for coming and spending your Saturday morning over here. And maybe we should go ahead and take a go around. And besides Hiro, everybody just introduce yourselves. Who the hell am I? Yeah, it's very presumptuous that everybody would know me, at least through my voice. But I'm Narimon Safavi, and I do commentary on WBEZ on the NPR station here on a show called Worldview. And I'm on usually on Fridays talking about global cultural experiences you can have in Chicago, kind of highlighting things. That's not my day job. I don't. I do that pro bono, and I'm basically a social entrepreneur focusing on the art sector right now, and have been doing a lot of cultural diplomacy projects between US and Iran these days, and also working on the idea of an arts incubator here in Chicago at some point in the near future, trying to pitch the city on selling me one of the buildings that we could turn into an arts incubator. But we will see how, but I'm much more interested in arts as economic development tool than anything else. Enough about me. Maybe we should go ahead and start with Jenny from that end and coming back this way.
Hi, I'm Jenny Button. Hi, Peter. I am a project manager. I co-produce a lot of public arts projects around town. I sit on the board of directors for the Wabash Lights. I have been involved with this infamous Halloween parade. I'm also working with a bunch of artists on different wards for the 50 by 50, and I'm the co-founder and experience curator at Fetiset and the Art Party. Fetiset is an online gallery about to have a space here coming up pretty soon. Watch out for it. And then we also do in-home and in-business art parties, which is essentially we custom curate a show for you and your guests, and we set it up in your home or your business.
Bueno?
Yes, hi, I'm Quenna Barrett. I'm the Education Programs Manager at the University of Chicago's Arts and Public Life, also known as the Arts Incubator. So we're spaced on the south side of the city, celebrating and promoting arts and culture on the south side. That's my 9 to 5, from 5 to whatever other time in the morning. I am a theater artist.
Hello, my name is Mary Rose Pavkovic. I'm the Managing Director of Chicago Public Art Group. Chicago Public Art Group is a 45-year-old organization that has produced thousands of public art all over the city and some very close here. I was just admiring the bench that we did at near North Montessori. It's still there. It was done by Lynn Takada, I believe in the 90s. And it's still beautiful. And at Chicago Public Art Group, like I said, we have a core group of artists that started the organization, one of them being William Walker, who is one of the artists on the Wall of Respect. And so we're really excited that this is the year of public art that is celebrating the Wall of Respect. That's for now.
Hi, my name is Lauren Pacheco. I'm an arts administrator and curator of public programming here in Chicago. I'm sure some folks are familiar with the murals on 16th Street in the Pilsen community. It's called Art in Public Places. I was hired by Alderman Solis in 2011 to develop and curate that project. So it went from about 3 to 4 old legacy murals to about 52 murals, new productions, as well as restoration projects as well. And I am going to be producing a series of public art projects in my new hometown of Gary, Indiana. Woo-hoo! We can probably talk a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Well, I want to kind of start the discussion about public art, not so much getting stuck on definitions of what public art is and what public space is, but as to what's missing in the public art that we experience here in Chicago, and maybe some global sources and inspiration that Hiro can point us direction to, that where we can draw some sort of a learning lessons. I recently heard something very disturbing, that like schools, the kids who are at the Benito Juarez school here in Chicago, every time our president makes a provocative statement about ethnic groups or whatever, like 7 or 8 additional students in that high school go on a suicide watch. Wow. And I am thinking that there's got to be something about the arts that can address that kind of an issue. And is public art supposed to, at this particular moment in our history, play more of a healing role, maybe try to bring communities together and address young people in a more sort of a nurturing sort of a direction? What do you guys think about that question?
I think traditionally the arts have always played a role in helping us to heal and escape from the reality of what's going on. If you go back to the Great Depression and people going to the theater and the age of the silver screen. And I think it's so important, you know, and Mark Kelly, I used to work very closely with Mark Kelly at Columbia. I also co-produced Big Walls. And we used to have this argument all the time, and he's like, Jenny Button, you're not gonna save the world with art. And I'm like, no, but I can save one kid who might, you know, and I think that's so big, and we forget that it's, when you connect with something on a level like that, it can just reach you so deeply, and I think it does have the power to change kids' lives.
If I could speak a little bit, so I work, my role is to sort of manage and direct our after-school arts programming for teens. And so we have programs in woodworking, in theater, and then in arts administration and community engagement. So our Teen Arts Council is developing and curating events and programs. Last year they actually curated an entire show of all teen artwork from across the city. And so I think what we are finding is, or one question that we like to ask is, how are we giving the means of production to these teenagers for whom a lot of, at least on the South Side, you know, arts have been taken out of the school day, right? And so what is our responsibility as community organizations, as artists, to help provide those spaces where they can sort of use art to process and heal, but not just that, to produce, right? And how are we enabling them and empowering them to be cultural producers as young folks? And so that's something that we strive towards. And then we're also paying those young people. So they don't have to pay to come to the programs. They're free, but then they're working alongside real world artists and also are earning stipends for that work. So they're gaining real skills, they're producing, and it's, like you said, it becomes an engine for economic opportunity in that neighborhood.
Yeah, I think Chicago is really experiencing a cultural moment, and it's intensified by DCASE's introduction of the 50 by 50 project, celebrating the role of public arts in our communities. Because I think it really sort of elevates and presents a platform of continued discourse as we sort of think about the role of the arts, right? So yeah, the arts can't solve every issue, right? But we can begin to have conversations about where the arts exist in our communities and what types of policy, what types of advocacy campaigns we can begin to engage in. You know, I always tell people, graffiti saved my brother's life. So my brother, our father passed away when we were in our early teens, and we were all sort of dealing with our own pain and processing it in very different ways. And my brother took to his creative spirit and went into the streets, and you know, we didn't know as a family that he was vandalizing properties, but he was at that time also getting courted by gang culture, was skipping school. And that was his creative outlet. And now as an adult, he's begun to process it and sort of get a sense of his own practice and his own sort of aesthetic. But, you know, the role of the arts in addressing some devastating, you know, numbers and statistics like at Juarez, you know, it's impactful, it's powerful, but it elevates the conversation, which is, you know, absolutely needed.
Absolutely. Mary Rose, did you want to add something?
Yeah. Definitely. We currently are working on different levels about community outreach through art. One is we have an After School Matters mural program that's in our studio, and the kids come in, and we have 2 of our core artists through After School Matters, teaching them how to create murals. And the kids have been coming to their classes sometimes like 3 or 4 different sessions because they love it. And they, and in fact, over the summer, were able to create a mural that was placed on a building across the street from us that was kind of meaningful because it talked about like mentors, older artists like William Walker and Carol Yasko, and newer artists like Max Sansing and Damon Lamar Reed. And they got to, talk about, these people and how they came up through the arts and how they're becoming successful, being artists now, and how, historically, how it was then, and how these older mentors, how they started it. So that's really, it's been really fun to watch these kids just kind of learn the history and learn the process and understand that art is a viable job for them, and or career. And then the second portion of that is to talk about mental health. We're trying to partner. We're partnering with hospitals and the Department of Public Health to kind of inject art in their mission to heal certain social issues that they're dealing with in certain communities all over the city. We were talking with the department that works with HIV/AIDS, and how an artist can come in so that they can kind of talk through the process of what they're going through and then create something that represents what they're going through, and so that their voice and their issues can be heard, and to start that healing process. So there's many levels on how art.
If I may follow up with you, Lauren, since you work with the City Hall and Aldermen. The city usually fashions itself as a sort of a neutral facilitator for these kinds of projects. What? Yeah. Well, yeah, that's exactly the point. And I think just as in issues of immigration, our city has been forced to take a position as a sanctuary city, kind of act almost like activists on that issue, as opposed to just, we're just basically telling the federal government, the hell with you, this is what we want to do. And this is the right moral thing to do, and it's the best use of our resources. We don't want to turn our policemen into immigration enforcement officers. And so shouldn't the city also, at this time of very shrill and charged discourse that really hurts a lot of young people who may not have necessarily very high self-esteem, should it not be also refashioning its role as activists in the public art space?
Sure, yes. In a perfect world, right? It would be amazing to recognize and have each aldermanic agenda have an intense focus on the facilitation of public arts, or just sort of arts programming, supplemental programming. It's really hard to answer this question because I was fortunate enough to work with Alderman Solis in the Pilsen community, which was a geographic area incredibly rich, had an incredibly rich legacy of public art production to begin with. There was an established cultural hub, right? Its amazing proximity to downtown and transit provided a series of opportunities for tourism, for economic development, connecting to the arts. And that's very rare, right? And so it was art-rich, park-rich. When you start to think of communities like on the south side, I'm born and raised on the south side of Chicago, which is considered not a food desert, but considered an art desert. So when you begin to think about the role of politicians in the facilitation or sort of the support of art, each ward has their own sort of characteristics. And my community that I'm from, Bryant Park, public art, if you were to really think of its agenda, is really sort of on the bottom in terms of a hierarchy of community-based needs, right? They're dealing with major gang issues. They're dealing with major complications to the community infrastructure. They have failing school systems. So when you think so realistically, if I were to sympathize with politicians, and looking at funding allocation, public art and the role of arts is probably really low on my agenda as well. But that's that series of conversations that, you know, it was really challenging to have with other aldermen, not necessarily Solis, because you really got the connection of art to economic development, art to revitalizing and lifting up communities. So yeah, it would be amazing, right, to have that as sort of a standard across all aldermanic wards. But it's also a really challenging conversation to have because of all of the reasons I outlined, and also because people value art in different ways, right? And people place different value systems on art. And so that's a set of brain systems that takes time to develop, again, when you're dealing with such challenging realities in communities.
Do you have any ideas as to what might elevate that on their agenda? Any provocative action we could do besides just nice conversations to be had with
Well,
them?
you know, I'm trained in the Saul Alinsky methodology of community organizing, so I'm all about people power and money and pushing and agitating and creating, you know, movement-based agendas. And, you know, it can happen from top down. You know, you have to allocate a certain percentage of your menu funds for public art production. It shouldn't have not only been generated and promoted by the 50 by 50 initiative. This should just be part of thinking and budget planning in the aldermanic offices. And, you know, people got to organize.
I think Hero wants to add
Yeah.
something to that.
I think art definitely can heal those things, but at the same time, I think if people are just looking at them, then you don't really understand it, and there's a lot of difficulty to understand things. I think the first things first, if you give more chances and the price, I mean, you guys are already doing it, but for younger kids to do and make art, I think that's probably more things it's needed. Like if you have a more program so that they can make a public art together, because same things as anything, doing it is way much more than just watching it.
Of course.
Yeah, and you know, so as your brother was saying, like kids love spray paint. Just give them a spray paint and get them paint more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you, just to follow up on, as a resident of Berlin, a city that has recently dealt with a lot of issues of religious extremist-inspired violence, and also you have groups like Pegida who are doing this German nationalist kind of a white thing, white supremacist kind of a thing. Is the city reacting to any of this with any sort of a public art gesture?
I'm not really sure if city is reacting as public art, but I do know graffiti lighters react to it. There is more,
okay.
yeah, there is more like a message coming out as a graffiti form, which seems to be quite ignored in this city. Like I heard, like if you do graffiti here, the next day it's going to be painted over, and I find that's kind of. I understand the graffiti, especially, is not for everyone, and not everyone likes it, and not everyone doesn't need to like it. But it's a little bit unhealthy to ignore some part in a group of people's voice, because it is some group of people's voice that city is ignoring by erasing it straight away.
I see. Very interesting. Jenny, did you want to add something?
You know, we touched on this earlier. We talked about Chicago is actually where spray paint was invented for the World's Fair, but it's the only city in the country where it's illegal to purchase or sell spray paint. So, you know, when I'm producing big walls, we run out to the suburbs, or we're buying it. We're having huge shipments of paint sent into us. I mean, when I'm talking lots of paint, you guys, we spent $15,000 on this one project alone this year in 2 weeks on spray paint. So all of this is going to Evanston and Oak Brook and all these other areas right outside of us. And it's a conversation that, excuse me, the city doesn't seem really ready to have that conversation, because we're still so proud about Mayor Daley's graffiti busters and all the money they spend eradicating graffiti every year. And it's funny because there's finally this interesting conversation that's coming up from building owners who are commissioning, like, you know, this great piece that you have on the building here, who don't want these buffed over right away. And before, they would come out and just do it right away. We've actually had Banksies in the city that were buffed over that people don't really know about that. But like, if you've seen him in the news at all lately, you know what we've lost out on there. So it's interesting, and it's steadily, you know, this 50 by 50 was the first time that I've really seen the city embrace graffiti as a true art form and a legit art form with these murals. And it was interesting that nobody really talks about this, but the 50 by 50 was optional. Each ward, they had the option of opting into or saying no and not matching these funds. So the city had funds that were then to be matched by the aldermen if they decided to do it. So a lot of people have done it. I know several, I'm not naming any wards, but I know some wards that have just kind of like whatever
I know
on it,
who
and they've
they
chosen
are.
a very innocuous art form or whatever to put up. And there are some artists who are in several wards, which is another interesting, this was the first time we've done it, so I'm sure every time, if this happens again, they'll get better at it. But there were a lot of artists that are being repeated in different wards, so it seemed like there wasn't a whole lot of, I don't know if you feel the same way. I've worked with Lauren on a lot of projects in the past like this, and I feel like Static has 3 walls and 50 by 50s, and I know artists who aren't considered at all. So it was an interesting,
Yeah, I think there's a hesitancy within the artist community to engage a bureaucracy like DCASE because there's a particular set of limitations. Folks may want to present pieces in a ward that is not as supportive or, again, sympathetic to the role of public art. So I can understand why, artists are being replicated across the city. There's a positive and a negative to that, but this is just the start of a conversation. I think folks will feel motivated to apply in the future.
Kwana, I'm curious, as an incubator, when you're looking at the list of potential candidates, do you look at the potential for public art application?
I would have to be completely transparent and say I'm not on that team who looks at those applications. So we do an artist in residence program, or every year we have between 3 and 5 artists who receive space and funding to work on projects. But yes, because that residency happens in partnership with the University of Chicago's Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. It's a long title. I just always have the sort of acronym in my head. But we are looking for artists who are willing to engage the community in the conversation about what the work is that they'll produce over their 10-month time with us. So I know that is a huge part of the consideration. How are they considering, the culture of the community? Where are they from in the city? What is the focus of their work? So those are definitely things that we're thinking about. And whether the piece will eventually exist outside or within the walls of the gallery or wherever it is going to be. I think that is less less specified, but we are we introduce them to the community centers, the other community centers in the neighborhood. So there's a vet center. There are other youth programming, and so we're trying to make sure that they know of the assets and the cultural assets that are in the neighborhood,
Yes.
so that they can work with those people during their residency, and that is very important to us.
Anything any of you want to say before we go to the audience for questions, for interaction?
Can I just say something about the 50 by 50? I feel like, yes, it was the first year that DCASE came out with, trying to make public art and how the alderman chooses artists and arts organizations on a more equitable. However, because it was the first time that aldermen were given kind of a portfolio of artists, there were many artists on there, and arts organizations that were not chosen. And that were, that have been doing public art. John Pittman Weber, Mirtis Wierzinski, Sonia Henderson, some artists that were not chosen that have done amazing work. Mirtis has done all the mosaics, I think, in Chicago. She did, Navy Pier. She's done many things with After School Matters. Been around forever. John Pittman Weber was a great friend of William Walker. Was introduced by Margaret Burroughs. He was not chosen. So, I think it's because the aldermen were not educated about who, were the artists in a sense, because, many of the artists were the young, kind of, more known now, present. So I'm just going to say that for me, yes, many artists were chosen, but I think it was because they're more well-known now.
So art education for our policymakers could be a good start for
Right.
this. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Sure. Sure. Go ahead.
Audience, could you
Who
talk
would
into
like
the
to
mic
ask
so
a
we can get it on
question?
the recording?
Anybody except Zygmunt.
Sorry, Ziggy.
I don't want things thrown at me.
On the 50-50, who determines the locations? And do you have a list of them?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't exactly know how that worked out, but I can tell you there was one wall that we actually started on before we found out we didn't have permission for the location. So the city did not do their background checks on a lot of these. Like we started painting on a Metro viaduct, and Metro came out and they were like, "What are you doing?" And I have like ABC News here. So it was it's been a learning curve for the city. So I'm not sure if they fully thought that went through, but they might next time.
I believe either the alderman or they had a group, a steering group that was chosen by, his office to kind of go out and case where in their ward would be a great place. I mean, I think that was the initial talk. And yes, I believe that some people just thought, well, the alderman approved it, so it's going to go through. Well, Chicago Public Art Group, as we've done this for 45 years. We know you have to go to BNSF, you have to go to CTA. These are, and that's the thing. It's like every city organization has their own little process, right? And it's not necessarily the same. And they don't talk to each other. Unfortunately, they live in silos still. And that was kind of like the hiccup or the big thing now that, like they need to talk to one another. They need to kind of create a process that's similar or the same, Anyway.
I'd also just like to give a shout out to SSA 33 and 27 have done a fair amount of public art in the last few years.
Which ones are those?
33 is Wicker Park, Bucktown.
33 is Wicker Park, okay.
And 27 is Westtown.
Westtown, I would say, so for the Westtown, they just formed a public arts committee. They've got the art walk that unfortunately really got rained out this year. But they've got some funding that they're putting straight towards murals. It's only going towards murals. And with Vertical Gallery and Chicago Trueborn and Maxwell Collette Gallery and Matthew Rockman Gallery all being in that area, they've been really well supported by the galleries because even when they have that small amount of funding, the galleries have been supplemental in funding some of it as well. So they've been awesome. They have been really great.
I'm so happy you brought the sort of the system of SSAs up because that is a perfect example of this public-private relationship, right? And sort of the continuation of public art production without having to really sort of deal with all of the messy bureaucracy, all of the politics, right? It's because they're able to provide the funding, right? They have the funding base, and then they have a particular set of relationships with public and private walls. And so, I mean, there's so much respect I have for SSAs and the role that they play in the public art ecosystem. Yeah.
I would like to ask your comments about this art and environment, which we do, because what we try to kind of prove or research is to see if art is not just a decoration, on the building, but it changes environments and people become more human. And this is a big thing in Chicago because, we have 700 plus people killed and violence. So that impact of that, that we will be treated, and people who do landscape, people who do little benches, etc., that they will not be seen as just artists who did that one little thing, but the people who are letting people to leave their apartment and be more engaged on the street. And that's why last year we started with Jane Jacobs' tribute. She was this little lady from New York who stopped all the highways going through the Greenwich Village and Soho because she thought that people have a right to live in small environment. And this come to Wicker Park, which built those big buildings, which are very boring buildings. And I have six banks across, and more big buildings with big food stores and vitamin stores and mattresses stores. And that is killing spirit, and art is helping. But it's, like I said, I think we would see ourselves not just as artists, but the people who build the human environment, which is so much needed for this stressed out and violent society.
Very good. That young lady over there she's standing behind the mic.
Me?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
I'm on. All right.
Yes.
I'm looking at the six of you there, and I'm looking at you as being a powerhouse. by that meaning that education is the key to everything. Education does not need to be formal. It does not need to be et cetera, et cetera. It can be technical. But however, in our formable years, we need to have in our school system the art, science, and also mathematics. The three of those three, the triad, are the secrets to anything and anyone that we want to be. We need to have our mathematics, not math, mathematics. We need to have our art. We need to have our science. And most of all, we need recess. Recess is very important because any problems that we have at recess, we will solve among ourselves without the aid of an adult, but because we will get to know each other. So I charge each and every one of you on this dais to put that side of our brain back into the education system.
That's great. And when are you running for alderwoman?
Yeah,
Soon?
exactly. Anybody want to respond to that? I think pretty much a comment, yeah.
That's great.
I mean, I think you're right. Absolutely. I actually used to be a recess coach. That's a position. So there's an organization, and I think there are several, but the organization I used to work for was called Playworks. And so we would go in and do social emotional development through games, right? A lot of our young folks, at least, in the schools where I've worked on the South Side and on the West Side, not arts and recess were the things that were cut, right? I was having to develop recess in a library. So there was no space for the youth to actually play. And I'm trying to resist using the words kids because it's adultist language, and so I just want to sort of call that out for myself. So like youth and young people. But I think you're absolutely right. So I think both the arts and the sort of gameplay, conflict resolution that can happen within a recess space, all of those things are highly, critical, I think, for our young people to be able to, have basic sort of human skills, which you were talking to a little bit. Also to sort of respond to the art and environment question. So like I said, the Arts Incubator is in the Washington Park neighborhood. I'm not sure how familiar y'all are with that, but we're west of Hyde Park. And it used to be a sort of a place where folks would just pass through, right? So they were either going to the lake or going to the university or going west to get to Midway Airport. In the time that the Arts Incubator has been there, we have seen violence decrease dramatically. I don't know the percentage right now, but we have seen a drop in violence. And it's not just
Is that
because-
verifiable?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Empirically verifiable.
Yeah, and like I won't attribute it all to just us, right? So there's another youth organization just down the street called the Clio Center, and they do a lot of youth violence prevention. So I think, but by being present and being active on that block and in that neighborhood, we can see a sort of reduction
Has
in
any
violence.
media outlet noticed that, brought that to attention?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah, right. And so how are we telling those stories, right? Yeah.
Hi, yes. I have, is this on? No. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So I'm here for several reasons. First, let me address the initial question, which nobody answered, was what do you do with troubled youth in schools who aren't interested in art? Because every one of you is dealing with students who already have an interest in art or are willing to participate. So having taught a very interesting course I'll get to in a second, what you need is the arts back in the schools from the Chicago schools. You guys can't do it. And I belong to an organization, Diaspora Rhythms, which has partnered with the University of Chicago on their Promise for Peace program. And also, we bring artists into high school and elementary schools to address art and teach the students what artists really do as well. But that's inside the school. To answer your initial question, what do you do with these 1 and 8? That's where you need the artist and art therapy in the school. The other aspect of this is to the woman who just spoke, I taught a course in the schools that was genetics and sculpture to elementary school students in the 5th, 6th, 7th grades, because the 8th graders just don't care. They just want to get out. which actually made the students think about how their science could be complemented with their art and come up with really innovative programs. And that used the National Genographic program to start with. All the students had their DNA analyzed and everything else. But that's a separate thing. So the other part is that nobody on this panel is a city arts person. And as an artist, trying to participate in the 50 by 50 program, the reason there are 2 and 3 artists in wards is because the program said any artist can be selected for 2 or 3 projects, which rules out a lot of artists, and there are aldermen that didn't participate at all. So I'm not sure how strong, I mean, it's a great program, but I'm not sure how overreaching it is.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's arguing that.
But the other thing I want to call your attention to is that I know you're talking about murals, but as a sculptor, I have to talk about public art from a sculptural point of view. And the thing that hasn't been mentioned is the Chicago Sculpture Exhibit, which is separate from 50 by 50, but is business-funded sculpture for 50 sculptures this year, all the way from the north side to the south side. So I just want to point to that. That's been in effect for 10 years, 11 years actually. And every year, the aldermen in the wards and the business people actually pay sculptors to put sculpture in the city, which is different than the city's public art program, which hires big name sculptors from all over the world, but not Chicago, to place things in Chicago Park areas. There's also Chicago Park District arts programs. So there's more public art than the public knows, but we need more input from the city to make this happen more easily. I guess that's what I want to
We
say.
need more money from the city. You know, one of the big things
I don't know
about
if it's money as much as just support.
I'm actually agreeing with you. I was actually thinking it's not just the programs or money that the city put it in. I think city need to make it easier for people to do public art, as in like to make the rules easier. As you were saying, like you have to go through so much process to do mural, but when you don't have to do that, then I think people just start doing it. Like a city doesn't even have to put money into it. Like I have seen where I was staying in Melbourne, I think that's relatively much easier place to do mural because less rules, and you don't need much permission. You do need the permission, but at the same time, even if you do without permission, you don't have a very big fine to it. I think that kind of losing the rules a bit probably makes much more easier to make public art. And I think, as you're saying, like for the sculptures and stuff also, it's not just about making more money.
One of the things that I've run into, I work with a sculpture artist named Ruth Azus Migdal. She's an 85-year-old woman who does 23-foot tall stainless steel sculptures. They're pretty monumental. One of the issues we were running into with her, I help her place things and do some press for her. And one of the issues has consistently been money, because even when the city is offering money, it cost us $7,000 to move one of her sculptures. So they offer her $1,500 a year to place one of her sculptures. So you can do the math there. She's losing out almost every time. And this is how it goes with public art, with a lot of the artists that I know that are creating monumental sculptures. The funding's just not there for them, so they're chasing it down through grants and things, which the grants always have these huge loopholes. So yes, bending the processes would definitely help in a lot of these.
Yeah, and also the gentleman raised a very legitimate point about, moving beyond murals. We think about public art. Most people, first thing that evokes in their imagination is that murals, and those are legitimate, and those are valid works of public art. But sculpture could be a part of it, and it could be other things. How about sound installations, video installations? Maybe Lisa Wagner can shed light on, can literature or poetry be a public art kind of a thing, or at least performances of it? We need to think about this a little bit out of the box ourselves in terms of when we think about public art.
We also talked about protest a little bit earlier, right? And folks don't talk about that as public art, but it's spectacle, right? Like it's street performance.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Lisa, you want to say something?
I just want to say thank you to the Art Institute and their students, and also those who thought about public art, because they have initiated public art. If you walk down Michigan Avenue, for an example, in the block of 1100 South Michigan Avenue, you'll see public art, which was instigated by the Art Institute. They have a program that they will use the buildings that are accessible for public art. So I want everyone to take a look at the Art Institute and what they're doing with their students and how they are promoting public art. Thank you.
So just kind of coming back to where we started, we're talking about Gwendolyn Brooks writing a poem about a mural that was protest, and a sculpture that was sanctioned by the city. So my question to all of you here today is, looking at this 50-year spread, we're looking at public art, the impact of public art. Have we seen the city start really embracing the neighborhood and these protest movements as a viable art form that they're willing to support in a much more cohesive way that is ground up, or are we still looking more at a model that is top down?
Who wants to go on the record?
Oh, God.
I can be the radical voice here.
I could, yeah, I mean, whatever.
I think anything city does, it's gonna be always top and down, right? I think, as I said, I think it's only the way to, if you people from Chicago want more things from bottom down, then the rule have to be a bit more loose. That's only the things, like everything city or organization or university does, it's gonna be top and down. There's no any other way, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to answer a question like this, because I think we all up here are trying to flatten the hierarchies of art and politics in the way that we work to make it more fair and equitable and accessible. I would imagine, from my experiences, public art facilitation, however you define it, is much more limited and less of a community-friendly process in particular communities, particularly the Loop, right? And as you expand out into neighborhoods where we can take a bit more risks, we could be more experimental and innovative, and we can kind of like disregard some policies and procedures and rules that exist out there. And then you sort of think about that we're operating very independently than some of these larger initiatives that take place in some of these more touristy-driven communities. It's also hard to sort of see tons of funding and support for projects like in the Loop or in Wicker Park or in Lincoln Park, and there are critical communities in Chicago that can really benefit from an arts portfolio. Yes. It's also very disheartening to see that there are particular institutional champions or very sort of strong artist champions. Like, we all don't have a Theaster Gates, right? And on the Southwest side, there really isn't a strong arts ambassador that can help lead the charge, develop agenda, push policy, create policy, agitate, right? And so we have to figure out how to sort of work within this world of like U Chicago, Theaster, folks like Mark Kelly and the Wabash, project, which is, hugely supported by funding and institutional support. Well, the optics is that my project, we talk about like the gap of funding. I mean,
we actually, there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about what happens there. We pulled that whole project off with very little funding, and a lot of it is privately funded. Columbia and the city take huge credit for everything that's done. Mark Kelly does a dedication at every mural. They didn't give us any money. We got zero money from the city. We didn't even get the 50 by 50 in our ward, you guys.
Oh, that's funny.
So Columbia's finally stepping up to bat to help us with that, but that's like My job is fundraising for the WAC, so if you guys want to talk to me afterwards and give me a lot of money, I would love it. We're always hurting. And like, you know, some of these projects, and that's the big thing, is we have a ton of support from the city. The Wabash Lights, we have a ton of support. Rom wants us to do the entire underside. It's a site-specific installation where we're doing lights on the underside of the Wabash L, so it's gonna light it up. There's a safety issue, it's gonna help out with safety in the area because it's actually lighting up the area. It's gonna drag visitors in, it's gonna make the area just more interesting to see. And Rom's 100% behind us, wants us to do the entire L, but he's giving us no money, so. Support is a loose
Seems
term.
like uptown.
Is there a possibility of, like, you know, out of this group that's here, we have assembled here, a sort of a core of a pressure group kind of emerging? Because, you know, there are some really good ideas and we need to maybe think this and define it a little bit more specifically. But, you know, if we have some planning time, we could redo this as sort of a teach-in and bring in media sponsors for this. You know, a lot of policymakers, they start to pay attention if they know that the media is going to be covering something. And maybe we can get some prominent art people, you know, maybe we could convince the Asa Gates to give us a couple of hours to show up at an event.
Pressure helps. Pressure helps.
No promises on my
You know, I've been talking for years about the establishment of a public art trust that's not tied, that doesn't live in City Hall, right? And that is like, you know, a public art producer, facilitator, artist-driven entity.
It needs to be independent.
Yeah, that needs to be independent, that not only supports the production of new artworks, but supports the documentation, the history, the legacy, the storytelling, the restoration of works. You know, in a space that is independent of aldermanic offices, in a space that is independent of City Hall, and it is a space that's independent of the organizations that I represent, right, and the projects that I represent. Because there has to be a pool of money. It's like the Public Art Trust in New York. I mean, it's such an amazing organization that's sustaining, right, and documenting the work that's being done in communities. And it's like, it's just mind-boggling that it doesn't exist here. So, you know, hopefully the 50 by 50 starts to instigate a conversation around that. I mean, who knows? But I've been talking about it for years. For like 7 years.
Yeah, and
this should happen.
And that could be something that could be headquartered at Chopin, and it has quarterly teach-in public meetings where we invite policymakers and all that to come, and some star attraction, and has media sponsorship, so that it actually becomes a sort of a pressure group of its own. And maybe we can find independent sources for funding, you know, go to the foundation and say, this is going to be independent of the City Hall, and we're going to try to hold the policymakers' feet to the fire on issues of public art. And you know, people at Chopin are generous enough to give us their big room upstairs for, you know, up to 300 people meeting quarterly, and see what we could do and measure our own progress.
Absolutely. You'll be coming back for that?
If I get invited.
And we even have a branch in Berlin.
Maybe on this useful note of Chopin Theater becoming headquarters for this movement. Thank you very much. Just kidding, we didn't talk about it. Maybe we should finish on this and have some more wine and champagne. For those of you who want to spray something, we have a room of tons of spray. You go left and then right and staircase to the things, and you know, I can explain later. So we just would like to say thank you very much for SSA 33, and you come on here, and to my wonderful wife. She's the one to blame for everything.
Yes, I take the blame for everything. Yes, thank you to SSA 33 for helping support this. Thank you to everyone. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, I'm getting to it. Thank you for Nariman.
My
WBD
pleasure.
For
Anna.
moderating, Lauren, Mary Rose, Queena, Hiro, and Jenny. I do think there were 2 people with questions, so I'd love to get their questions in, and then I think we kind of wrap things up.
Actually, it's not a question, it's more a comment.
What the heck?
It's okay? Okay. I truly believe that what you're all talking about has got to be bottom up. This top down is just not going to do it. But in order for it to be bottom up, there has to be an education, and I don't mean formal education, but an education of the public, because I think in a lot of neighborhoods, in a lot of areas, art, if you use the word art, you're considered elitist. And so they will look at that, you'll say, well, we want to bring art into your neighborhood, we want to, you know, whatever it is you want to do. They look at you like, are you crazy? You know, as you say, there's so many other, or as you said, I think it was, there were so many other issues, you know, gang violence, other things. Art, we don't need art. So until you get people to think about it as not elitist, as something that's part of your everyday life, that can affect your life and your children's life, until you get that mentality looked at and dealt with, you're never going to reach these certain areas, and you're never going to reach certain aldermen. I guess that's the comment. I just, for whatever it's worth.
And I think that's viable. It's also part of why murals are taking over the majority of the conversation right now, because I think street art and graffiti has made it so accessible. You know, it's putting art in front of people's faces, and these are untrained artists who are just grabbing a can. They're not using these really expensive oils and everything. So it's brought art to people, and it's also brought these messages to people. You know, people have literally died and been arrested for their art to be shown. It was so important to them that they hung from the top of a intersection sign, you know, to like make this piece. So it's putting art in front of people where, you know, it wasn't maybe accessible before. Now there's galleries and alleys, literally, you know.
But I think her point is well taken, that it could be that in the marketing aspect of this, we may want to avoid using the term art too much. We could call it public creativity project, whatever. Not that we don't want to, we want to totally avoid it, but we have to be a little bit more strategic or tactical about how we use, what kind of a language we use on this, not to come across as elitist, so.
And really quickly, from a community organizing perspective, it's really important as we have these ideas, we may not be from a particular community, it's really important to be very sensitive when you parachute in, right? And to have a real sort of sense of the landscape, right? Have a sense of the opposition, have a sense of the community-based needs. Because when you parachute in, that's not a most effective model in terms of saying, we want to introduce art, because apparently you guys have no sense of what art means. Right. When there's art that's happening in church basements, art that's happening at park districts, you know, so there has to be a real sort of awareness of what's happening community by community. But I absolutely agree, this term art could be really sort of scary, right? And sort of uncomfortable for people. Yeah, absolutely.
I also feel that, on the other hand, though, is like, I feel like art should be not considered elitist, right? It's part
an
of,
unfortunate thing in this country.
right? But and I feel like if we, you know, inject it in things that the community, you know, is doing, that is, you know, like gang violence or some sort of public health issue, if art is injected in those, you know, in a way of educating, in a way of healing, then you're bringing in the community to deal with those issues through art. And I don't know, whatever the term could be, public creativity, whatever, but you know.
You can only bring them in if they feel it's necessary. And what I'm saying is, by labeling it art, you have eliminated a lot of people, because they're just going to go, you know.
Part of the elitism comes from, like Lauren said, she lives in an art desert. You know, on the south side, it was more of an art desert. So, you know, in the suburbs where I went to school, we had home ec, we had art classes, we had our option of several art classes. You guys, they don't have art in these urban schools, so that's where it becomes an elitist thing, because let's face it, right now we've only made it available to a certain group of people. So it has become an elitist thing. So until it's reintroduced to those areas as well, and through these cultural sensitivities that you have to be so aware of, it's going to continue to be that way.
Hero said, you know, you give kids, get the kids.
Yeah.
Hey, give them a spray can.
I don't think.
Don't call it art. Just here's
Yeah.
a spray
Well,
can,
yeah.
have fun.
I think so too. Yeah, I think so too.
But by
That's.
saying, you know, here's a spray can, go make some art, the kid goes,
They don't know what to do, and they think they get judged.
so you
But I think that's quite difficult for organization to do that. Though this is about more about everyone else. Like everyone, when you're kids, you do drawings and you make stuff, and somehow when you grow up, you start getting judged of what you are doing. That's a lot of people stop drawing or making stuff. And I think I was lucky enough. I did get complimented on what I was drawing or making. It's just, it could even be a sand castle. And just as everyone, if you encourage the kids. I think that's all we can do. I think this is nothing you can do by organization, to be honest, or by the city.
Hi. I have a looking ahead and then kind of looking back as well. Graffiti, street art has always been kind of a DIY endeavor. And over the last 10 years, it's, you know, you've had this convergence of Latino graffiti, black graffiti, the punk aesthetic from the Europeans and like maybe the downtown New York. And now it's all mixed together and it's acceptable. Looking ahead, once the city gets, for lack of a better word, decorated and people start liking this mural and that sculpture, how do you keep the ball rolling? How do you keep being fresh? And where do you see this whole thing being in 10 or 15 years? Because if you look back 10 or 15 years, we're having an entirely different discussion. Granted, the city of Chicago's always late to adopt these kind of things.
Again, I don't think this is something organization or city can actually do something about it. As in, like, they can support giving a funding to do more of these things.
In Chicago, it's about allowing it.
Yeah, I think so. Well, that's first things, and it is great that if city can support it by funding it and all those things. But again, this is coming from everyone. Like if they like it, and there's always younger artists and painters and sculptors and the people who want to do things comes out. So if there is a place to do it, I think it will keep rolling.
I think it's similar to any movement that becomes popular too. People find a way to break free and do the next new thing. We've had this conversation lately about how we're kind of in a post-street art and post-graffiti phase, because back before people were getting permission walls, they were doing them illegally, and they were doing them because their work was so important they wanted it to be seen, not because they wanted it to be seen to be hung in a museum or a gallery. So, you know, there's still this graffiti machismo attitude that comes along with guys who are still avoiding that scene because they don't want to be a part of the mainstream trend of art. But now, you know, I've seen there's light writing and there's projection on buildings, and people are constantly changing with technology, changing with cans, even the cans. If you look at graffiti from 15 years ago, it's completely different than now. The can controls, like, pencil can sprays exist where you can get a tiny fine line, and it's just completely different than it was before. So the evolution of the artwork itself is changing. So it's constant. I mean, if you look at PETA, P-E-E-T-A, he's from Germany, his entire crew is doing incredible three-dimensional graffiti that's flat, but it looks like it's popping off the wall. So they're always changing, and with the technology, it's going to continue to shape and form.
Actually, we kind of tend to forget our own Chicago's rich history. As a global player in this sector. I've talked to several Polish Americans who lived in Chicago, and Chicago was, you know, in the 70s and 80s, was a hotbed of house music. That's where what we call experimental music or whatever was really born in Chicago. And Chicago has a global reputation in that. We don't really understand that here ourselves. But from that, emerged when in the 90s, in the late 80s and the early 90s, when the Berlin Wall fell. You know, there were all these kids in Eastern Europe who were enamored by house music and graffiti, the so-called graffiti that was inspired by that. And this one particular Polish-American woman that I know, she was taking Chicago graffiti artists, African-American and Latinos, to Poland, to East Germany, which was recently liberated, and she was paying them, getting them paid by the city halls of these places, $10,000, $15,000 to do Chicago-style graffiti over there.
That's great.
Because that's what the young people over there who were just coming out of the the Iron Curtain kind of a thing, thought was the cool thing to do. Of course, we've now killed that goose by all the restrictions that we have for graffiti over here in Chicago ourselves, and we've probably painted over some of those masterpieces that inspired those kids in Eastern Europe to want to have it because of the Mayor Daley's covering up the graffitis. But we need to kind of like reclaim our own rich history in these things, and that we used to be a hotbed of that kind of a creativity ourselves.
You guys should all look up and pay attention to Meeting of Styles. It just happened in September. It's the meeting of all the graffiti minds from all over the world. They come in, and the south side of Chicago gets transformed. Crawford Steel Mill, all along 56, all of that gets transformed, and it's a huge graffiti session that the city doesn't really publicize, but they're like with us on it. But you should check it out and go down there and support the artist.
Yeah, I'm so happy you brought that up, Jenny. And to Peter's question, this sort of this convergence of different art forms from graffiti to street, I think has become more embraced and more sort of from a broad-based perspective, more accessible, because primarily the public imagination has been sort of exploded and is super wide open, right? So we're curious, we're hungry, we're eager, we want to go out and spot stuff, right? So that's sort of an amazing sort of component of this sort of this becoming this blurring, right, of art forms, and I also think just to sort of think about how we can sort of transform and sort of move sort of the conversation forward. It's not only this sort of integration of like art and tech, right, or art and science, right, but it's also like looking at walls or spaces where public art exists, but having a more rotating sort of idea to it. So rather than having a mural that's a legacy mural that's intended to live up there for 10, 15, 20 years, right? We've dumped more money into it, to preserving it, to maintaining it. Might there be a more interesting conversation about having walls with just rotating murals so that it's rotating out every 6 months, every year, every 2 years. And that's a way to, have those fresh ideas, to tap into new talent, to develop a constituency of emerging public artists and different types of, graph and street art driven talent out there, and to give them the platform and the public sphere presence, right? Because murals are gonna get tagged. If you put it in the public sphere, it's gonna get weathered by the Mother Nature, and it's gonna get hit by vandals. It's just the nature of it, So if we take this more sort of idea of like Wynwood Walls perspective, where stuff is constantly churning, moving, I think that's a much more interesting way to develop a tourism, an arts-focused destination plan and strategy for communities. Yeah. It's just sort of lo-fi, let's just rotate the stuff out.
The impermanence is kind of the draw too, right? So like if you hear there's a Banksy here, but it may not be here in a year, you're gonna go now. You're not gonna wait until the next time you're in town.
Yeah. So like the culture seekers, and how do we sort of tap into that? Yeah.
Okay, one more.
I guess it's my turn now. But I really hope I'm not really beating a dead horse with this. But going on earlier, I'm currently involved in helping develop a community museum in North Lawndale, and that's the whole, how do you bring art to this place that you don't want to be seen as an elitist. And last May there was a mural that was opened, and it was local artists that designed it, and it was an entire community event, and they put it up. And there's with this street, there's just random men walking around, and there's organization called like Mad Men. If you're not from the neighborhood, or even they've never seen you before, like they bring you to this slot, and it's the building that we have right now. It's very, very, very sketchy, and they're just bursting with pride with this mural. And I think it's just really, in order to engage in areas that are art deserts, it's just really making it community focused as a segue, and then just keep growing, as you guys were saying, like the cycling out is a really good idea. But then I was also kind of wondering with the 50 for 50, if there will be more importance placed on the public art, and if you think that will help change any of the strict regulations which we currently have.
Mary Rose.
So our organization has done a lot of community art. I mean, most of our art is it's community-based, and we bring artists to the community, and there's a discussion about the design and even the installation the community is part of. So then there is this pride in it, and that they want to maintain it. It becomes part of their DNA. How does 50 by 50 affect that? In a perfect world, the aldermen will allow the community, a larger part of their ward, to have a voice in it, to be part of it. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. Usually, aldermen, well, okay, I shouldn't say that. Sometimes it happens that they know of an organization and they're comfortable, and they've done great work in the past, and this is who they're going to go to, right? Because they know that this is what's been done. And I think 50 by 50 was trying to kind of make it more equitable, so that more artists from all over the city could be someone from Bronzeville could have art up in Saguenash, like that kind of thing. Did that happen? No. Maybe a little bit, but not really. And maybe it's the start. It's a movement towards that. But yeah, I don't know. I guess that's the long answer to that.
It's a lovely thought, the 50 by 50. I think there's so much of it's where we come back to the grassroots level versus coming from the top down. I think when all of that bureaucracy gets involved, there's just so many things to make this successful, and it almost seemed like we were just jumping on the bandwagon because Cincinnati, I don't know if you guys saw, I'm from Cincinnati, so I'm really proud of this festival. Blink, which just happened, was amazing. The Philadelphia mural scene is incredible. So it almost felt like Chicago was like, oh shit, you guys, we missed the boat. We need to hurry up and do something arts oriented. 2017 is year of public arts. Also, nobody mentioned that Artist Month didn't happen in October. So these were all kind of things that were it just seems a little disjointed at this point. But Mark Kelly has, if he puts his mind to something, it's going to happen. Dealing with the city, I can see where there were some places where it got watered down, but he's got some big ideas. So I think he is a great step in the right direction for public arts in Chicago, whether or not the 50 by 50 is a great example of that.
Right, and also just to kind of the idea of top down, bottom up. I mean, Lucia, you mentioned about the Wall of Respect and how it was kind of given a nod where there was this huge, celebration of Picasso. And I think that is, that is the tone of what we're seeing right now. And I'm hoping that, as it moves in the future, hopefully there are more public art initiatives that the city is going to push, that maybe, that it'll kind of move a little, it'll move that arm towards the bottom up versus the top down.
It's kind of our political climate too, right? We're more in a scene where we are looking more towards grassroots movements, where we are looking more towards getting together because we're seeing a lot of inaction at the top. So it may be something that this is forcing to organically happen too.
If there are no more burning questions, then we just, on that note, will conclude and just go back to Zygmunt's invitation to have some more wine and some food. Thank you very much.